And we're back. So we just finished the intuition ethic. And now we're going to do might equals right. We've all heard of this. Might does not make right. That's what you hear. And the basic idea is that the strongest are usually the people that are the most correct. And of course, the criticism of that is, does strength necessarily mean that you are a good person, being stronger? And of course, this invites, the seeking of revenge. And that doesn't necessarily lead to long-term advantage, although it does lead to short-term advantage. And there is a place for this kind of reasoning. You have to think about primitive man. Okay? Imagine a small group of humans wandering around the forests of Europe or Africa or Asia, or wherever they were, right? And, the strongest were the most likely to be the most successful hunters. And yet we've seen that kind of evolve throughout time. I mean, people that have better lawyers seem to be getting ahead somehow, etc. So the justice is in the interest of the stronger. Now, of course, as we'll talk about during our corruption lecture, in some ways, people are strong at a certain period of time, or they're willing to spend a certain amount of money on a certain task. And so this is kind of a shortcut. Time is money, that kind of thing. Those who wish to exert their strength on some tasks will be rewarded accordingly. Again, it's not a perfect ethical principle. And again, don't look so much at strength in terms of physical force, or not always even having money. Consider an organizational setting where your boss does whatever he or she wishes because he or she is the boss. It's unfortunate, but that is certainly something that happens. Might equals right. Now we are shifting to the organization ethic. Be loyal to the organization. And the idea is that you should be so loyal to the organization that you don't necessarily look after your own interest. And this is kind of strange. You think, well, has this ever really happened? Well, it does. As we'll talk about during cross-cultural management. In some countries, you will actually have people that will literally work themselves to death. They will work at their desk so long that they will forget to eat and drink, and they will literally have a heart attack and die at their desk. That is more common than you think. I know that, for example, when I was in the Army, had a colleague had a sick child, and she went home to take care of her child, and didn't fill out the right form, and her boss said, this is a violation of selfless service. In other words, she was supposed to let her child get sick and be miserable at home. A very young child. That was evidently what she was supposed to do. She was supposed to be loyal to her work and not take care of her family. That was the conclusion. So it's also not a perfect ethical principle either. The principle of equal freedom. Shift this right over here. So we are. Okay, so that basically means you can do, you have any sort of freedom of action unless you deprive somebody of their own freedom. Okay, and of course the difficult part of this is, what if two people wish to exercise or express their own degree of freedom? Then what do you do? Now, where do you see this a lot? You see it in issues like freedom of religion. Okay, now most people would say as long as someone practices their religion in the privacy of their own home and does not use that religion to justify bad behavior or dangerous behavior, then that's okay. But then you can apply it to a variety of other topics as well. For example, recreational drug use. Well, most people could argue that as long as they're doing it in the privacy of their own home, not exposing other people, then that might be okay. And you see the same argument applied to things like same-sex marriage. So it can be applied to a lot of things. So as long as I can do whatever I want, as long as I'm not hurting anybody else. But then again, maybe you are hurting someone else. Think about cigarette smokers. Well, I'm smoking cigarettes in the privacy of my own home. Isn't that okay? Well, what if it gets into the air ducts and gets into your neighbor's apartment? There's no tiebreaker for these kinds of difficult situations. Okay. The proportionality ethic. Now, this is kind of the basic idea of this is, every decision that we make has good and evil consequences. And what you want to try to do is make decisions such that the good consequences outweigh the evil consequences. This is a very difficult doctrine to understand, but it's a way of weighing the pros and cons of every decision. Try to make decisions that have more good consequences than evil consequences. And you can think about this in the workplace. For example, when you hire a person for a job, by definition, or by default, pardon me, you have not hired somebody else for that same position. Right? So it's really good for one person, not as good for someone else, but hopefully better for the organization that's hired them. That's part of the proportionality ethic. Okay? Every time you do something good, there is a bad consequence. And at the same time, every time you do something bad, there might be a good consequence associated with that too. We've also got the rights ethic. And of course, this comes from the Enlightenment era, predominantly John Locke, who talked about natural rights, rights that you are born with, rights that are God-given, rights that the state or other people have no business taking from you. And so everybody under the rights ethic has certain entitlements that others have a duty to respect. Now, of course, these entitlements, the way we're taught it in school is that, according to ethical universalism, there are certain things that can never be taken away. But it's really more of an ethical relativist kind of thing. Here in the United States, for example, we look at things like pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right? Those are kind of fundamental rights. In France, for example, liberty, equality, and fraternity. So those are kind of different rights. You see that? And of course, in the U.S., we have certain rights that are quite specific to us. For example, the right to bear arms. So if you wish to go shopping in a sleeveless t-shirt, you can. So we all have different interpretations of that. Now the criticism, of course, sometimes we can stretch these rights into selfish demands or entitlements. So for example, technically I have the right to free speech, right? Does that mean that I should say hateful and horrible things to people just because I have the right to do so? You may have the right to do something, but that doesn't always mean that you should. Okay, do you guys? Hopefully, you can see the difference between them. I have the right to freedom of assembly. Does that mean that I should assemble in a street and block traffic? Okay, so it's not always as clear-cut as it sounds. So I'm looking at our time. We'll go ahead and come back to our next video in a moment.